Good evening and welcome once again to The Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries. Seconds before we came live, and we are live, although what you're seeing is a recording. As I said last week, we try and treat it as a live program, and to that extent I was having an intense argument about how much work everybody does with our camera crew, only to decide that I wasn't going to win the argument anyway. The chats behind the camera always feel that the people in front of the camera have it so easy. We just have to sit here and look at a few notes and talk for half an hour, and they have to wire everything up and do the sound checks and the lighting checks and whatever else they do, And you can't argue with them. You can't argue with them. They're great people. We couldn't do it without them, obviously, and thank God they're here, because without their total support and all they do behind the scenes, this program or any of our programs wouldn't be possible. And it's something that's not said enough. Sometimes we don't say it enough on our worship service programs and on our Sunshine Club, and I don't say it enough, and I should do. They make me look good, and believe me, if you know me, if they can make me look good, that's not bad at all. Anyway, we were talking about Paul's letter to the Romans, right? Just a quick recap for those of you who didn't tune in last week. We said that the letter to the Romans is the longest one. It's one of the 7 letters that not just modern scholars but second century Christians believed was actually written by Paul. And I want to talk about that. It occurred to me while I was saying that last week, and I didn't have it in my notes, and I didn't want to digress too far from the subject under discussion. But we talk about, the second century church. You've got to think about this. The second century church said, as far as we know, that, these 7 letters, the ones I mentioned, were written by Paul, and the others we're not so sure about. But it didn't bother them. They didn't have to get uptight about it. If you want to attribute that letter to Paul, fine, we don't care. Go ahead and do it. And I have to ask people when they say, how can you say that Paul didn't write Hebrews, that, as I said in one of the programs 2 or 3 weeks ago, that Priscilla wrote it. I said, what difference does it make? Has it suddenly changed what the letter says? If we knew that Romans, and we're pretty sure Paul wrote it, but if we knew that Romans wasn't written by Paul, would it make a big deal of difference as to what the letter says? If the Gospel of John was actually written by Josiah, or James, or Bartholomew, or Barabbas, or somebody, would it make a difference to what the Gospel says? Remember Shakespeare's immortal words, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. I mean, just for those of you who didn't catch it, if you got a rose, okay, it's called a rose, that's what we call it. It smells sweet. But if you called it a weed, would it change the way it smelled? Of course not. Would it change the beauty of it? No. And sometimes we get too tied up with, if Paul didn't write it, maybe it's not worth reading. How can you say that? I take a lot of flack, excuse the expression, but I do. I take a lot of flack from from the team in there, because whilst they're all devout Christian men and I love them dearly, they don't always see eye to eye with some of the things I say. I mean, I got at the break this time, I went in to refill my coffee cup, and I usually make some stupid comment like, so what did you think? And I should learn not to say anything, but I do. I go and say, so what do you think, guys? Was it all right? And they go, I don't agree with your dates. Not about my theology, not about, Paul's writing to the Romans in a different style, this sort of thing. My dates. What's wrong with my dates? Well, I don't necessarily agree with 50 to 58 and that he was in Corinth in 57. I don't think, if that's what you disagree with, we're on good ground. And I should point this out, that when I mention dates, they are the generally accepted dates by, and I say modern scholars, I'm talking from the mid-50s onwards, because we've looked at the books and the letters and the other archaeological research that's being done and other documents and things that have survived, and we've been a bit better with our dates. I mean, we don't know for sure. We do not know what year Jesus died in. We call it 33 because, or 30, whatever, whichever particular line you subscribe to. But don't forget, we invented that, or we made the calendar, afterwards. Started 0 at Jesus' birth, or 3, or 6, whichever it was. But we don't know that either. Now we've got the Arab calendar, we've got the Jewish calendar to go by, and we'll pick the dates from there. But we don't really know exactly. We think Paul was in Corinth, judging by what he wrote and said, in 57, 59, 58 rather, when he wrote Romans. But I mean, I wouldn't hang my life's insurance on it, because I can't be sure. I can say it appears that way. We don't have I mean, can you remember, even yourself, if somebody says to you, when did you buy that blue suit, the one with the stripes in it? And you think, well, was that 2001, 2002? Unless you can pull out the receipt for it, or somebody has a record of you doing it, you don't know. It's based on your memory. All right. Again, I'm digressing, but as I say, I was quite relieved. If the only thing they found to complain about was my dating system, I don't feel so bad. But anyway, after Paul, goes on to explain that in chapter 5 about baptism initiates a new life of grace, and the person who emerges from baptism is dead to sin and alive to God in Christ. Okay, so he then goes on in chapter 6 to say, well, Christians then, okay, if that's where you're going to believe it, all right, then they must be governed by holiness, not by sin. Yeah, Christianity 101. Holiness alone will lead to eternal life. And then he goes on to say, and this is what caused so much controversy and still does, that the Jewish law ceases to be binding. Now, you've got to remember that most of the early Christians were, in fact, the early church people were Jews. And they were following the Jewish law, only they just accepted that Jesus was the Messiah. So this is kind of a big stumbling block, okay? The law, Paul says, arouses sinful passions. And as being dead to sin, okay, if the law, because it's so restrictive and so hard to follow, makes you rebel against it and do things, and since as a Christian you're dead to sin, you can't follow the law. You must be dead to the law. You can't have it both ways. Okay? And since Rome, at the time when Paul was writing this letter, enjoyed a somewhat unusual reputation, the highest seat of learning and the lowest seat of depravity at the same time, he urges the Romans. He says, live not according to the flesh, according to the Spirit. I mean, these are words that we've used in our prayers, in our admonitions throughout Christianity to the modern time. Okay? But living by the Spirit, we all say it. I'm in the Spirit, Through the Spirit, Paul says, all believers become spiritual children of God. Okay? Called by God to glory. And this, of course, is the strength behind Christianity. I mean, how many times as Paul says in chapter 8, how many times have people said, if God's for us, who could be against us? I mean, it's a very big rallying cry. So he gets that off his chest. It's kind of harsh towards the Jews. Now, since he's writing to a Roman, people in Rome, I've got to assume that he's writing to a predominantly Gentile church. Because if he'd written this letter to a Jewish Christian church, some of the content of it would be really hard to swallow. And then, of course, he goes on, the next topic in the letter. And as I said, it's a long letter. And if you read it last week, you'll know it's a long letter. I mean, Romans takes a bit of sitting down to. It's almost like a short novel. At least some of these short stories that you get these days. But his next topic is the problem. How do you reconcile the gift of salvation in faith in Jesus Christ with the salvation of the Jewish people? I mean, God promises in the Old Testament, you're my people, I'm your God, as long as I'm with you, you're saved. Okay? And how do you reconcile that? And it's kind of interesting how Paul does this, because he starts off by being really sorrowful, being really lamenting the fact that he was born a Jew. He says, I know what they're going through. I know what it's like. I'm not saying, oh, it's easy, you just do this, this. No. I know what it's like. But he wants desperately, and I'm sure Paul said this more than once, it's just he's sort of exposed it in this letter. And as I said last week, Romans is probably Paul putting together all the things over the past 8-10 years that he's been preaching all over, the different churches, putting it all together in a statement of faith, which is basically what Romans is. He wants this deep desire to help the Israelites, the firstborn children of God. But he then goes on to explain that the Christian covenant that we make with God by grace is not a betrayal of Abraham's covenant. Okay, it's kind of interesting in chapter 10. He says, those who believe with the heart are the children of the promise, the spiritual children of Israel, all right? The genetic children of Israel, the Jewish race, stumbled, in Paul's words, when they mistook Jewish law for the means of salvation. Most of the Jewish law is really a way of life, not about salvation. But the Jews, Paul goes on to say, are not being totally cast aside. He says that he has great hopes that the Jews will come to express faith in Jesus, enabling God to keep his original promise. So he doesn't really, in my opinion, he doesn't really say, well, this is what's going to happen. He's hoping that eventually all the Jews will come to realize that Jesus is the Messiah. Well, it's taken a long time, because here we are 2,000 odd years later and it hasn't happened yet. Okay? And so he finishes with this statement of Christian faith. I mean, Romans is known as a faith document, and yes it is. It spells it out. He goes on with a fairly lengthy diatribe, in my view. He kind of lays it on the line to the Romans about how to live a proper Christian life. It's almost as if he assumes that they have no idea how to live a Christian life because they live in Rome, where it's all debauchery and politics and things like that. But he talks about harmony and humility and love. Today we would agree with the same things. Harmony, humility and love. He urges chastity and forbearance. Now, chastity in Rome in those days was a sought after commodity. You have to read your Roman history to really understand that. And submission, unto Caesar, render unto Caesar, etc. He had to make a point of that, okay? But then he goes back to the theme, if you will, the end time theme of his other letters. He makes the point that and he says it's doubly, makes it doubly important. It's really, really important to act righteously in a time which he thinks is approaching the end times. You can call it apocalyptic, you can call it what you will, but he still, even at this late stage in his missionary work, preaching career, Paul is still of the opinion, whilst he doesn't believe that the end times are instantly imminent, like within his own lifetime perhaps, I think he's come to realize, perhaps not in his lifetime, he certainly thinks it's not going to be very long. So he's saying, it's doubly important to act and live in harmony and love and peace in these times. He also, and this is a section you don't hear people preach much about, but he also mandates tolerance and freedom of religious conscience within the church. Wow. Freedom of religious conscience. In other words, don't necessarily take everything they say as gospel. Have the freedom, no pun intended there, by the way, have the freedom to work it out for yourself. He talks, in his case, he's talking about the strong in faith aren't to sit in judgment and punish the the people who are weak in faith. And that, to Paul, is those who've given up the Jewish law to accept, become sort of, if you like, we don't obey the law, we're full-time Christians. He's now saying, don't get on to the people who haven't quite given up on observing, the Jewish dietary laws and the rituals and everything else. Okay? They'll come around in time. But don't start saying, hey, you're all wrong. It's like somebody who's been a Christian all their lives and knows all the answers and can quote you any verse of the Bible anytime, just like that, being intolerant of somebody who's stumbling around having just been baptized and not quite sure what it's all about. Something we should consider for today. Okay. And then he finishes up that section, which is, to me, is always interesting, with a set of Old Testament quotations, right, which sort of prophesy, if you will, how the worship of God is spreading among all the nations. He's done his research. He's saying, look, it says in the Old Testament that the word of God will spread among all nations. Okay? Follows that up with a dissection in which he discusses his own ministry, what he's been doing, and he proves an authority by sort of stating his own credentials. It's first time really, well, not the first time, second time, Paul says, something about boasting. I have reason to boast of my work for God in chapter 15. He goes on to tell the Romans what he's been doing. He's talking about taking the contributions which came from the Gentile church, from Greek and Macedonia, those churches there, and the money to Jerusalem, which is going through a famine, if you remember. Okay? So he's telling them that I'm shortly going to leave and go to Jerusalem and take all this money, which is supposed to help them. I always wonder how they did that. Did he carry it in sacks on a donkey or what? Or in chests or whatever. But anyway, and then Paul must have had some premonition of what was going to happen, because he speculates that, hey, and I might run into some problems. So Paul knows that what he's been doing in the Gentile world is not sitting well back in Jerusalem. He knows he's upset some powerful people. So he has some premonition. So maybe that colored the letter as well. Maybe it's his last chance to get something out there and tell it like it is, for perhaps the last chance he gets. And then, of course, in chapter 16, there's a long list of greetings and highs and how you're doing and all that. And again, scholars believe were added, a lot of them, by a later editor. Somebody wanting to include more people in the thing. Maybe not, I don't honestly know. If you say, what's the preponderance of belief, it's 60-40 that most of the salutations were added on. Okay? And then he sends his normal, greetings to the Romans, as in Paul's natural style, and asks them to be wary of troublemakers and things like that. So obviously he's believing that some of the troubles he had are, coming on. Okay? Now let's look at when Paul was writing this. This is a really traumatic time for the new church. Christianity had not yet, despite what you might think, evolved into a distinct religion. It didn't have a hierarchy of bishops and rulers and things like that. It didn't really even have a defined dogma. I mean, in its earliest years, and I've said this before, people don't like to hear it, but it's true, it's an offshoot of Judaism. Believers in Jesus in the early days, including all the 12 apostles, were born Jewish, identified themselves as Jews who believed that the Old Testament prophecies had reached their fulfillment in Jesus. Okay? I mean, Christians didn't appear in the lexicon, if you like, until after Paul's ministry at Antioch, decades after Christ's crucifixion. The church wasn't even a single unified body. There was no central authority. It's a conglomeration of individual communities separated by vast distances for today and then. Okay? And they depended for their spiritual guidance, if you will, on traveling preachers or missionaries like Paul and others. And there were others, many others. You tend to think the only person preaching the faith out there was Paul. There wasn't. There were others. He mentioned some of them, as you know. Christians in the years after Jesus lived in constant fear of persecution, and at the same time, constant expectation of the second coming, where Jesus would come back to earth and save the faithful. It took years, decades, before Christians began to realize that God's timing is not theirs. The letters that Paul writes, or wrote rather, to respond to these conditions of the early church, he addresses them to specific communities, most of which, excuse me, have been established by Paul himself. Okay, so in an era when travel was difficult, slow, took days to get 20 miles was probably could even be 2 days travel. Okay, a bit like my car, I think sometimes. Communication was difficult. Everything was, run with a letter and a cleft stick. They didn't have Morse code or anything like that. And Paul's letters were his way of preserving his spirit, his entrepreneurial missionary zeal in a community from a distance. And the aim of the letters, as always, was to inspire the unity of the believers, and secondly, or if not firstly maybe, to instruct on difficult points of doctrine. Remember, the Gospels hadn't been written yet. There were no guidebooks on how to be a Christian 101. Okay? People picked up ideas from this preacher, that preacher, put the two together, and instead of making 4, it made 6 or 5. And so they got the wrong idea. And Paul's letters are highly individualized, and they address specific problems of the communities. Okay? Now, here's the big thing. Generally, as far as we can tell, with the possible exception of the letter to the Romans, because it is, after all, the dissertation on what we believe. It's the mission statement, if you will. Okay? But except for Romans, most of Paul's letters, in fact all of Paul's letters, let's say, show very little evidence that they were intended to endure as permanent documents. They were what they were, simply letters written to put out the fire or put out the problem or assist the church or the individual in the work that they were doing. Okay? It's an amazing example of God's insight into us, that letters written not as a permanent guide but as an instruction or as a help to sort out a problem could be so valid today. To me, it just says that we haven't changed very much. If a letter written to the Corinthians 2,000 years ago, and the message it contains is still valid in a church today because the same problems exist. It's totally amazing. It's mind-boggling to me. I mean, Paul, like most early Christians, expected Jesus to come back. And he wrote his letters to address things that were happening here and now. Not to provide a lasting, a lasting treatise on how the church should be run and how the church should be perpetuated. Paul didn't think the church would go on any further. I mean, once Jesus came back, what further need would there be of the church? Paul wasn't thinking that way. I mean, the Gospels, if you will, are the history of the birth of the faith. How it happened, how we started. They all follow a similar pattern. They all describe Jesus working miracles and preaching. And even then, Jesus couldn't convince people of his divinity until the resurrection. And that is mind-boggling to me too. If you could look at the face of God and still not understand what he's saying, absolutely amazing. But when the triumphant, of course, is when the apostles see the resurrected Christ, and their faith is confirmed. Their faith was not all that strong. But the entire story of the Gospels, in case you haven't missed it, is designed to stress the importance of faith for the Christian. But you need to remember that practically the only thing that separated early Christians from non-believing Jews was faith in Jesus. But nowhere in the Gospels, nowhere, anywhere, is the opposition between faith and law made so clear as in Romans. It really lays it down. Paul raises up the role of faith, describes it very clearly as the sole means by which people can attain salvation. Paul makes it very clear. He says, by Jesus' sacrifice, God gave men the free gift of the covenant of salvation. And it is only by faith in Jesus that one attains salvation. So Romans is the definitive statement of our faith. I mean, that's the way we are today, isn't it? Romans is the basis on which all our faith is based. So the idea that Paul is putting down his whole theology at what he perceives to be either the high point of his life or at least the highest point he's got to so far makes Romans possibly the most important, most influential letter in the whole of the Bible, certainly in the New Testament. The Gospels tell us how the faith came about. Paul makes it very clear as how to achieve that faith and what to do about it afterwards. Okay? So, there you go. Read Romans again, see if you can recap on that, and see if you get anything else out of it. Next week, for those of you who are interested, we'll be starting into Thessalonians. It's a fairly in-depth study, and I think you'll enjoy it. But so, there's your homework. Read Thessalonians 1 and 2. Let's say just 1. We'll do 2 next time, right? Till then, don't forget to read your Bible whenever you can. God bless. Good night.